And I yield to Ms. Hannah-Busa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jacobson, before we move off of this, I just want to be clear. So you're saying that you do have congressional authority to basically establish these areas under the Everglades Headwater National, such as the Everglades Headwater National Wildlife Refuge. That's correct, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that. Now, as part of the ongoing public process to establish the wildlife refuge, the service has been working in close coordination with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission on a memorandum of understanding, as I understand it, regarding public access in these areas. Will you provide us with an update of how that's going, the MOU?
Certainly, ma'am. The MOU is progressing very well. There have been many meetings and exchanges of the draft of the MOU with the Florida Wildlife Commission. The plan is to manage these refuge areas jointly with the Florida Wildlife Commission, and many of them under the state's existing wildlife management areas. So we have close partnership with the state. That MOU is progressing, and we hope to have it completed well in time to start these co-management activities.
Ms. Jacobson, borrowing from Hawaii, one of the things we do have is we have something called the Legacy Lands Fund, which is a percentage of recorded our Bureau of Conveyances. We record land transactions. The percentage of that fund goes into like a legacy land, which then assists in the purchasing of easements and fee simple, very similar to what you're talking about here. Is there such an equivalent fund in the state of Florida that can be called upon in the purchasing of private lands when they want to sell? You made it very clear that it's for willing buyers and sellers. Well, you're the willing buyer, but sellers, and, for example, the easements. Is that also available in Florida?
I can't speak to what sorts of funding is available in Florida. However, we would fully expect that our funding source, which would primarily be the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that we would complement that with other funding opportunities to protect contiguous land. So, for example, if an area is protected already or is contemplated for protection through a similar fund, maybe that Florida has, similar to that of Hawaii, perhaps we would purchase part of that acreage under the Land and Water Conservation Fund and then together meld a contiguous conservation unit. So we fully expect to look for all leveraging opportunities on this acreage.
You also mentioned in your testimony that there is a provision that permits for people to donate lands as well.
Yes, ma'am.
And then you've had people who are interested in doing exactly that, donating land to the refuge.
It is my understanding that the ranchers have expressed some preliminary interest in exploring that idea.
Now, talking about ranchers and huntsmen, people like that, how is the service working with the sportsman community in Florida to ensure new hunting and fishing access opportunities within the existing refuge units in the state of Florida?
I'm going to turn that over to Mr. Mercedes, but I'll say just as a general matter that both the Refuge Act itself and the proposals for this particular refuge specifically contemplate hunting as a wildlife-dependent recreational use, and in all areas where hunting currently exists on lands that are contemplated for this refuge and conservation area, that hunting will be allowed to continue. And I'm going to let Mr. Mercedes discuss further what discussions we've had with the sportsman community.
Thank you.
First, I'll just say that it was mentioned, I think there were 28 national wildlife refuges in the state. Many of those refuges are small islands off the coast, or they're barrier islands that are either unsuitable for hunting. They would not have huntable species on it. So there are several in that category where hunting isn't even a possibility. We do have some other refuges that, such as Lake Wales Ridge, that are very small units. They were established to protect very endangered plants, and it would be difficult to provide. We don't have any public access in there, not just hunting. But that said, we have had several meetings with the hunters that have expressed concerns in the South Florida community. We have met with them recently. The Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission hosted a meeting for us to listen to suggestions they have on providing additional hunt opportunities elsewhere, and we are exploring that as we speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I yield back, and I recognize Ms. Hannah Yusuf.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's follow along that line, Secretary Darcy. I think for anyone who's listening to us, they may be getting confused about what the Army Corps' by ourselves, the Army Corps' role is in all of this, and what SERP, as you call it, which is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, and how does it then fit in what Ms. Jacobson is talking about, which is the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. So can someone in a short sentence or so tell us how the two fits together, whether they overlap, and for anyone listening in, that they can get a better idea of what the Army Corps' role is and what Fish and Wildlife's role is?
Certainly. The Army Corps of Engineers builds stuff. And so we're the engineers who try to get the water right. What in talking about the refuge, which would be north of the lake, that will help as has been discussed, in helping to keep the water north, and also to help in a natural treatment of the water. So it's all connected. It's a huge system, and it's a huge complex system. And so what we're trying to do in order to get the water right, both the quality, the quantity, the distribution, and the timing of it, is to be working with the Department of Interior, because of the refuges and the endangered species impacts of whatever we do. So there's a balance between what we do in our construction, whether it's around the lake or south, or in constructing a stormwater treatment area. The Corps of Engineers has constructed one stormwater treatment area. The state of Florida has constructed 5 other ones. Again, they're all south of there. But they're all connected because the water has to eventually go through Loxahatchee, the Big Cypress, and all of those wildlife refuges, as well as the preservation areas as well.
Ms. Jacobson, so how do you fit in?
Thank you. So if the Corps builds stuff, the Fish and Wildlife Service conserves stuff. So with respect to the ongoing SERP project and the establishment of the Everglades Headwaters Refuge, the intent of the refuge area is to stop a stem of development that would otherwise cause perhaps a loss of hydrology, natural hydrology of this water flow. So by creating a refuge, we, as I said before, will restore up to 26,000 acres of wetlands. Wetlands serve as an important filter for nutrients and other pollutants. Will allow a natural hydrologic flow into the floodplain areas. Will provide for natural storage areas, which will be much cheaper than constructed storage areas. And all of this is intended to contribute to the overall health of the ecosystem, to very much complement, and perhaps ultimately, maybe in the long run, reduce partially the cost of the SERP effort.
So you're like the nature's way of doing what the SERP project has to do, because we haven't done the natural way correctly. Would that be a right way of saying it?
That is our intention, absolutely.
Now, both of you are speaking to the funding source of the Land, Water, and Conservation Fund. Am I hearing you correctly?
The Land and Water Conservation Fund will be used for the establishment of the refuge. The funding for any of the SERP projects comes from appropriations.
So let's go back to the funding through the Land, Water, and Conservation Fund. Though you've already testified that the administration hasn't specifically requested funds for 2012, I guess the question is, are there, notwithstanding that, funds like carrying over or still remaining available to meet the needs that you have for this upcoming fiscal year?
We've obviously talked about a lot of different funding pots and funding needs here. So the place where we have not requested funding is the Revenue Sharing Act offset. That is the piece of the funding provided by Congress, as opposed to just derived from refuge revenues, to compensate counties and other local authorities for loss of potential tax revenue. separately the acquisition funding for the fee acquisitions as well as the easements, we anticipate that would come from the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is appropriated by Congress through royalties and similar receipts to the General Treasury.
So when you're out there in the community and you're meeting with landowners, ranchers, whoever they may be, who may be considering either selling an easement or selling in fee simple, you view that as a process that will eventually end up with funding from the Land Water Conservation Fund, but I assume from what you're saying that you don't believe that that's a necessary funding pot now. Is that correct?
As soon as we receive the final authorities through the environmental assessment and the planning documents to establish administratively the boundaries of a refuge, we'll then begin the negotiations with willing sellers for the acquisition of those properties. And through a process that goes on every year, the Department of Interior will look at the pot of land and water conservation funds available and the various acquisitions, both for parks, refuges, and otherwise, plus the Forest Service also taps into Land and Water Conservation Fund, and make funding decisions appropriately.
So it's rather premature now because your EA doesn't appear to even be completed at this point.
That's correct. The draft is still out for public comment. Then, of course, we'll have to go through the final, so it would be a ways off.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair. Testimony, you said that you served as a, I think it was within the Department of Interior as an undersecretary or something for President Reagan. Was that correct?
Yes, I was Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks.
So, Mr. Horn, this tension that we sort of hear between the hunters and the sportsmen with conservation types of policies and how that affects access, that must be nothing new to you. You must have had those questions back then as well. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely, and I would just add that the issue in Florida is of particular importance, personal importance. In the mid-1980s, I negotiated the land trade approved by Congress in 1988 that expanded Big Cypress by 85,000 acres, added and completed or started from scratch the 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge, and added 7,500 acres to complete the Florida Panther Refuge. And as I said, Congress approved that in 1988. I can assure you that when I was doing those negotiations, I made lots of promises to folks that we were going to try to maintain traditional access and secure hunting. And unfortunately, all those good faith promises I made have not been kept. And I share some of those concerns. So it's just these issues have been around for quite some time, and I would strongly suggest that if there's a decision that a refuge be established in the northern headwaters, I think it's contingent upon Congress to pass some statutory guarantees, strong guarantees to protect these traditional rights, because the good faith promises made by characters like me have not been kept in the intervening 20 years.
So, Mr. Horn, you said 7,500 acres for the Florida Panthers, for example. Were there promises made about the access for hunting within that area as well?
My recollection was, yes, we said that we were trying to complete that refuge, and that we recognized back in, this is in the 86, 87 time frame, that there was a history of traditional rights because it abuts the Big Cypress Preserve, that we'd do our best to try to maintain those traditional types of activities. Much the same in Big Cypress, and unfortunately, the ability to deliver on those promises, it hasn't occurred.
Mr. Horn, you said something very interesting. We'll do our best, and that seems to be, whenever, government always says that, right? We will do our best, but that's not necessarily a promise that it will actually be there.
Well, let me put it this way. There were a variety of promises made associated with those land expansions that Congress approved in 1988. I think over years there's been good faith attempts by some folks to comply with those promises. I think then there was insufficient understanding of the opposition from certain activists to maintenance of these traditional activities, and there wasn't the type of strong statutory guarantees. Part of the problem, for example, in 1997, when this committee and Congress produced the Wildlife Refuge Improvement Act, it added the specific language about hunting and fishing being priority public uses and making findings that these were legitimate activities, that was one of the first steps taken to try to codify in law the type of promises that had previously been made and not been sufficient given the legal status of issues.
Thank you, Mr. Hoare. Mr. Dantzler, you represent a new organization called the Northern Everglades Alliance, and part of your testimony is that you do have hunters and sportsmen and sports activity related people within your organization, and yet you actually are here supporting the preservation area. So can you tell us how your interests, or those that you represent, and what Mr. Horn said, how are you going to represent both interests?
Well, I don't believe they're mutually exclusive. One needs the other, and I would take issue with the other panelists who say there's no growth pressure in this area. There is development pressure. If you look at the boundaries of this refuge, you'll see gated subdivisions across the street from some of those public properties that we've already acquired. When I was growing up, I was part of a hunting camp called Johnson Island. It's now the gated golf community of Solivita. I was part of a hunting camp called the Huckleberry. It's now Poinciana. During the entire decade of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, 1,000 people a day moved to Florida. That's 365,000 people a year. Every single year, we lost 200,000 acres of ag land to development. Now, I assure you that many of those people that came here located in this area. They weren't just in that 20-mile strip around the coast. They were in the middle part of the state. And once we emerge from this Great Recession, and I use that capital G and capital R, once we emerge from this Great Recession, as long as the sun still keeps shining and the sand is still white, we are going to have those kinds of explosive population growth rates. And this part of Florida is going to be in the crosshairs. I assure you of that. Now, there has been a concern that this refuge is not going to directly benefit Everglades Restoration. I respectfully disagree. I will concede that the water quality benefits are marginal. But they do exist. If you're going to have 150,000 acres of land where water can flow over those acres the way it used to be over time, that's going to benefit water quality to some extent. But it's marginal, and reasonable people can disagree. But as it relates to water quantity, there is a tremendous potential for assistance. I mean, just look at what you have to do to build an STA down in the Everglades. You have to buy the land, you then have to hire engineers, you then have to install pumps, in many cases to pump water uphill so you can run it through the STAs. The cost is exponentially higher than if you use land that's the way God made it to be your storage area. So yes, we have a tremendous need for additional water storage capacity in the Everglades system to do the Everglades restoration effort that we would like. But we can use these properties on the north side to help with water quantity. And I can assure you the most ugly wars that Florida is ever going to have are going to be over water. And unless we grow the water pie, and unless we find a way for there to be more water for the environment, more water for agriculture, and more water for people, we're going to have some of the ugliest wars you've ever seen, and the environment is going to lose in that regard. People are going to get it first, agriculture is probably going to get it next, and the environment's going to get it third. So yes, this project can help with Everglades restoration.
Thank you, Mr. Dantzler. I know I'm out of time, but I just want to tell you that I understand your statement while you're trying to preserve old Florida. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You, Pat. Mr. Dantzler and Mr. Draper, one of you can answer this. I'm hearing conflicting things here. I'm hearing about 150,000 acres if we put it into complete easements, whether you'll have access, or whether we should buy 50,000 of it in fee simple, then we can then ensure to have access. Now, let me just tell you what I understand. The 150,000 acres now, you don't have access. So the 50,000, if you purchase, it really would be it would be determined by probably what 50,000 you purchase. That would then determine what kind of access you could have. As to the remaining 100,000, that would be by way of easements, because it's really still the title is technically still held with the private landowner. Whatever you're able to negotiate in terms of that easement will then determine the quality or the type of access you would then have. They could give, for example, hunters access, airboaters access if they want, or they could say no, if that's part of the easement negotiations, and if the federal government or the state, whoever may buy that easement, then agrees to that. Am I understanding this discussion correctly?
That is correct. The 50,000 acres that would be acquired in fee simple, we've heard all the panelists before us say there would be access for that. Now, what that access would be, what the activities would be, I can't speak for the agency. But I've been all over those woods, and I know what's there, and I think a wide variety of hunting opportunities is going to be made available. The 100,000 acres that would be where the government would buy a conservation easement, the activities that are allowed on that 100,000 acres is a negotiation between the property owner and the government. And I've seen a pretty wide variety of things go into conservation easements. In all candor, I doubt there would be, in fact, I know there would not be wholesale access allowed on that 100,000 acres. Property owners are just not going to allow that. But I think that under the right set of controlled circumstances, they would. Maybe a youth hunt, maybe a special opportunity hunt, some way that they could limit where those hunters would be, make sure they're going to close gates behind them, all those kind of things that property owners are concerned about. But at least you would have the chance to have hunting on that 100,000 acres, and you would have it on the 50,000 acres, and that's 50,000 more acres than you have now. So, to me it seems like, notwithstanding this friction that exists between user groups and fish and wildlife, it would seem that the sporting community would be for the refuge because it's going to create at a minimum 50,000 acres for hunting.
Well, we can't ignore what former Secretary Horn said, which is that government has a habit also of saying we will make our best efforts to ensure that things would become available, but then it may not necessarily be available, so that I understand their hesitancy. But the main focus here is that if nothing is done and the 150,000 acres remains as it is, there is no access.
The main point here, Congresswoman, is that if we don't do this, we fear that this part of Florida is going to go the way that many other parts of Florida have gone. And there's going to be this ever-expanding territory of asphalt and concrete.
No, I understand that point. I'm focusing on the statement and the concern regarding access.
Yes.
If nothing is done, then there is no guarantee of any access. But I do understand your point on basically the old Florida and preserving it.
Right.
Now, Mr. Draper, you are part of the effort, I assume, that was Florida Forever. So how does Florida Forever, and you made a very interesting statement to me, which was about agriculture and how important that is, and then that's also part of this conservation, preservation efforts. Now, can you educate me a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to do so. This refuge proposal actually is preceded by an effort in Florida called the Florida Forever, part of which is the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, which run through the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in cooperation with other agencies. And that program uses Florida Forever funds to purchase a type of an easement on ranch and timberlands, and has been used very successfully so far. In that case, the easement, Mr. Dantzler talked about easements being written in different ways. This easement is written in a way to promote the continued operation of the land for either timber or cattle production. In that way, it takes the development pressure off the land. It takes the financial pressure, in some cases, off the landowner to be able to continue to manage that land. And in many cases, these easements are targeted toward lands that have specifically, and this is in the state statute, I helped to write that statute, so I know it very well. The statute says where there's attributes that are helpful to both water and wildlife. I want to add a point, if I can, to this hunting debate. All of that 150,000 acres that would be purchased, most of that land is being hunted right now. It's just being hunted currently through lease arrangements, and it's income-producing activity for many of the landowners.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.